Now that we've taken a look at the perceiving functions, we're going to jump into the judging functions. In the first video of Module 2, we learned that judging is the process of judging the information that our mind takes in. This can be done with thinking, determining whether something makes sense, or we can do this with our feelings, determining whether something is good or bad. I'll be covering the thinking functions in this video. And by the way, as a heads up, I'm going to be using the terms TI user and TE user in this video. This is simply referring to somebody whose mind prefers to use either TI or TE as their main or preferred judging function. All right, so let's get started with extroverted thinking, or TE. Extroverted thinking is entirely consumed with what works, what gets the job done, what actions need to be taken to create some objective change in the outer world. It acquires some type of goal that can be measured in the outer or extroverted world and determines whether it will work or it won't. And then it lends energy to a TE user to take the steps necessary to accomplish that goal. If the strategy works, great. It is a successful thought and will be remembered from that point on as the way you achieve that goal. If the desired outcome was not achieved though, then TE will go back to the drawing board and devise a better strategy for achieving that goal. The way these strategies are created is by looking at what other people have done to achieve the same or a similar outcome. A list of functional steps are then extracted from their strategy, and that's the new playbook that you're going to try to see if that one might be more successful. TE is perhaps the most objective cognitive function that there is because the way that it measures the correctness of a thought is entirely based on whether it achieved an observable, objective result. It isn't interested in understanding something simply for the sake of understanding something. It's much more functional than that. It just asks, did it work or not? From a TE perspective, when sharing information, that information sort of has an objective tied in with it. Why are you sharing information if not to use that information to achieve some type of desired outcome? That's a very TE-oriented way of thinking about how information is exchanged. TE is also driven to create systems that allow problems to be solved in the most efficient way possible continuously through time. Remember that for TE, a thought isn't complete until it has resulted in either a pass or a fail in the real world. Thus, TE users tend to be exceedingly hard workers because they're constantly filled with this action-oriented energy that compels them to finish their thoughts. TE also can be slightly domineering at times because it doesn't really have a lot of patience for things that put roadblocks in front of accomplishing goals, things like personal feelings or laziness. TE is pretty much the backbone of most processes in companies and governments around the world. Like I said, it's driven to create systems with sequential steps that can continue to be followed to produce some type of outcome. That might be making profit for a company or gathering taxes for a government. TE also judges the quality of information based on its perceived functional merit. That is, information that's acquired from people who haven't really accomplished anything is not really seen as valuable. However, information acquired from people who have achieved something, particularly if it's the goal that you're after, is valuable. As such, it has an innate feeling that status is an important marker for the competence and validity of someone's worth. In line with this, TE will be driven to acquire institutionally accepted certification of achievement, which will vary from society to society. That could be having good grades, or a university degree, or a high-paying job, or owning a company, or having sold a company, or any other metric of success that might label somebody in some society as successful. Whenever your society or social group deems as successful is likely something that TE users will want to be. Bringing all of that together, TE users tend to be very productive, dependable, and hardworking. They also tend to have little patience for laziness and like living their lives according to effective principles that allow them to achieve goals that are important to them. Many often make daily schedules that they live their life by and feel a sense of satisfaction whenever they cross something off the list because that's the completion of a thought. The upside to being like this is that society tends to reward this type of behavior with status and wealth. The downside is that their bulldozing nature can sometimes rub other people the wrong way, and so personal relationships can sometimes suffer. Oftentimes, TE users will also end up neglecting the internal feelings that they have associated with the actions that they take and just push them aside because those kind of get in the way of accomplishing things. This can sometimes lead to workaholism, where their sense of identity is wrapped up in the productive work that they do. All right, let's move over to introverted thinking, or TI. TI is an entirely subjective process that is concerned with determining whether or not something is true or not, whether it makes logical sense. To aid in this process, TI tries to remove all emotional bias when it is considering an argument or an idea. In contrast with TE, which determines the correctness of a thought based on whether some outer world impact was achieved. TI determines the correctness of a thought solely by itself. If something makes sense to TI, then cool, the thought is done. I think it makes sense, and therefore it makes sense. This can create a distinct behavioral difference between TE users and TI users. TE users energetically get into action to achieve goals, regardless of their intellectual interest in those goals. As long as it achieves some type of accomplishment that they're after, TE will provide them with the energy to go and take the steps necessary to achieve that goal. TI, on the other hand, is a bit more fussy. TI is only going to provide mental energy for things that it is intellectually interested in trying to figure out or solve. And the interests of each TI user are going to be very unique to the individual. So TI users can sometimes end up doing nothing at all. Or they can end up spending 20 hours a day working obsessively on some type of hobby of theirs, or working on a technical problem or a technical skill that they're building out. Literally anything that catches their interest. To TI, there's an innate satisfaction in figuring something out. That could be solving a complex logic puzzle, or it could be building a sophisticated machine. TI simply loves increasing its competence in skills it values. That could be becoming the best programmer, or welder, or mechanic, or powerlifter, or video game player, literally just for its own sake. Some of those can make you money, and others can't. TI doesn't care. Unless, of course, making money happens to be a puzzle that a particular TI user really wants to solve. TI also constructs and adopts logical frameworks that help it categorize information and come to logical conclusions about things. For example, the entire MBTI framework that I'm describing to you right now might be something TI would like to use to categorize information on human cognition and allow it to make better social decisions with. Every TI user is going to have their own nebulous framework that their mind constructs in order to categorize information of things that they find interesting and helps them make logical conclusions that they care about. Even if those frameworks aren't exactly something that they consciously think about very often or that they could describe to somebody else. TI is driven to understand the actual deeper truth of things. It isn't satisfied simply with knowing what gets the job done. TI users want to know why something works. And so accomplishing a task isn't as innately rewarding to a TI user as is coming to a greater understanding of how something works or learning more about something that they're interested in. Because TI wants to be correct and truthful, it tries its best to maintain objectivity when making its conclusions. Interestingly, this objectivity can sometimes lead to somewhat controversial thinking. TI users might often forego social harmony in favor of just telling the truth as they see it. If they think someone is lying or accepting some falsehood just because everyone else is accepting that falsehood, they'll want to call it out. Or at the very least, when they're asked for their opinion, they won't want to lie simply to spare feelings or to be socially appropriate. Unfortunately for TI users, people don't always respond well to that. Voicing uncomfortable truths can lead to both social and professional repercussions. TE, on the other hand, isn't as attached to the truth, and so it might be a lot more okay with accepting a social lie as long as it's the most effective way for them to accomplish a goal that they're after. Because TI comes to its own subjective conclusions about whether things make sense or not, it doesn't share that proclivity with TE for judging sources of information as good or bad. TI users will absorb information from any source and determine its value for themselves. They believe that even though somebody might not have formal education or credentials, the information and knowledge that they have might still be valuable. TI users also really don't like being told what to do or how to do things. They want to figure things out themselves. If a rule doesn't make sense to them, they simply won't follow it. This innate stubbornness can be very difficult for other people to deal with, particularly with young and immature TI users who are, nevertheless, very confident that they know what makes sense in every situation. The benefit of TI on a grander scale is that it often facilitates technological invention and intellectual advancement. TI is concerned with logical consistency, both in an abstract and a concrete sense, and so can be useful for determining whether a new device might work or whether a new philosophical perspective is logically cogent or not. It is also often used in a social context to make fun of the silly things that humans do that don't necessarily make all that much sense. Many comedians are TI users who use their subjective perspective to judge society from a unique point of view. For example, without emotional biases, comedians can look at how humans behave or what we find socially appropriate and see that a lot of it doesn't really make all that much sense. Like how keeping your elbows off the dinner table is important. Why? All right, that wraps up the thinking functions. In the next video, we'll be covering the feeling functions.